Welcome to the Level Design Podcast. In this episode, we talk about ogres, open source, and Unreal Engines with the outstanding Steve Streeting. Let's get on with the show. Welcome one and all.
Hello, thank you.
Hi guys.
Hello, welcome.
Hello.
It's an interesting time to be recording podcasts. You can usually find people at home, and this time we've managed to find, wandering a small island of Guernsey, the multi-talented and many-skilled Steve Streeting. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you for having me. I mean, I'm not sure I can live up to that intro, but I'll do my best.
It's okay. You can lie on your CV all you want, and no one's going to check up. We've actually talked before on another podcast, and I'm not pimping my other podcast, with a different hat of web development because you've had a long and varied career.
Yeah, I mean, let's not stress the long too much. Yeah, I mean, this current hat is game development, and I've tried to do that on and off for a very long time indeed. And it's really only now, recently, that I've been doing it full time and actually giving it a proper go. I ended up segueing many times into various different areas of tech, including writing my own 3D engine, because as we've alluded to, I'm rather old, and back in the day nobody gave you 3D engines to play with. You had to make them yourself. So I ended up doing that, as many people did, and got distracted by that for quite a long time. As you know, obviously, I used to run the open source project called Ogre. That was started about 20 years ago now.
Is it still going?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, strangely enough, they did 2 releases in the same week, which was a case of they kind of stabilized one of the releases and then it came out with another one, which they've been working on in parallel, just in sort of different technology streams. So yeah, I mean, the community is great. They've continued with it 10 years since my retirement. So yeah, good on them.
I love projects that have a life of their own. I worked on a project that I kind of helped out on. Like, open source is generally you help out on a project, and before you know it, you know more about it than other people that are helping out, and they ask you to run it. And I worked on a plugin for Eclipse, and that has carried on. The people are still using it, and somebody else is maintaining it now. I mean, that's the beauty of open source, right? It's like if the company goes...
Well, that's the thing. I mean, right? as you know, I grew up in a very small island with no internet, and always assumed that I knew nothing, and I was just grasping at straws most of the time, trying to find out how to make things. And I did that for a long time, and eventually did it again with Ogre. That wasn't my first engine by a long shot. And just put it out there. Just mostly, actually, the reason I put it out there to begin with was I was trying to find somewhere to back it up in a reasonable fashion, and I'd only recently learned about open source and figured, oh hey, I'm swapping code with people anyway. I used to do it through FTP sites, the various quite active FTP sites in places like Sweden and Finland. They had some quite famous, right. If I listed something called sunet.se and xulu.fi, people would know those from back in the day as places people used to exchange code. So having someone kind of organizing my version control and backing it all up for me, and also allowing me to interact with other people who felt the same way about the code that I was writing was ideal. And I just kind of fell into open source by accident.
We should point out that you are on the island that you referred to, because this was off the show of recording, was that you're actually based in Guernsey, which is for the non-Britishers around there. It's a small island of the south of the Isles of England and Great Britain, just more closer to France.
Yeah, we're about 30 miles off France, so we're closer to there than we are to the UK, yeah. I was born here, and like I say, I grew up pre-internet, kind of assumed that no one would ever pay me to do anything related with computers. This was a thing where I would hear of people who, obviously I played games, so I knew that people made games, but I was under the impression that to do that you had to have some special training or, go to a particular university or something. I had no idea how any of this stuff worked. Nobody in my family had really ever been to university. And it was the kind of thing that, I just assumed other people did that. And I would try and get as much information as I could from, the BBC ran their own sort of computer educational program over the time that I was growing up. So that was one source.
Well, they had the BBC Micro, right?
Yeah.
So that was literally by the BBC.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that was one sort of element of my education, but there was no curriculum for it. There were no courses you could take, particularly that I was aware of anyway. You just learnt in your lunch times, watching watching TV programs and getting magazines which would give you games that you could type in BASIC that almost 100% of the time didn't work. So I always thought that was an intentional thing, so that it would teach you how to fix it.
Troubleshooting.
I can totally relate to that. I was born in Cyprus. Obviously, I'm a lot younger, but still in Cyprus, there was no game development community, nothing, no master's degree or like bachelor's degree about game development. So accidentally, actually, when I was about 22, I think, a development degree did appear, and I'm like, yes, I'm going to do that straight away. So straight up after my bachelor's degree, I did that. So I can definitely relate to your story.
Yeah, I think in a way it's sort of an advantage in some ways. I mean, obviously a disadvantage is you're not really bumping into people who do all this stuff. I talked to other people who grew up in, say, places around Guildford and other places like that, where they just would bump into people who did this stuff, and it just they became aware from quite a young age that this was a thing that you could do. And so in a way it was a disadvantage, but in other ways it was kind of an advantage, because I always assumed that I knew nothing, and I was always grasping for as much information as I could possibly find from anywhere. We would swap listings, photocopies of photocopies of photocopies of listings of books that someone had found at some point. We're not sure who originally had the book, but someone had it, and we'd try and often you had bits missing, so you'd just be trying to piece together this sort of assembly definition of a Z80 machine, and you were trying to figure out how to make it work, and most of the time failing. And in a way it was kind of a useful education, because when I now come across things that are daunting and a bit scrappy and I don't really have any good information about it, I'm used to that. It's not something that I expect to be taught. I kind of have to figure it out as I go along. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts.
I mean, you kind of jump from one open source like Ogre 3D, which is a hell of a thing to do, and then you invent version control. I mean, I'm exaggerating.
that's maybe overselling it a little bit, yeah.
yeah. You started working on the tool that I both love and hate, which is SourceTree.
I did, yeah.
At Atlassian, which is that's one of the biggest companies. I say biggest companies. It's like everyone knows Jira, right? Like
yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone loves or hates Jira. I mean,
yeah, whether you love or hate it with a passion,
but you have to use it,
at
right?
some point.
I mean, I'll be honest. I always preferred Trello, so I was really glad when they bought Trello. I felt guilty all the time because I really like using Trello. I mean, I had to use Jira all the time, obviously, and Jira is fine for a certain size of a company and a certain level of complexity. It's exactly the kind of tool you need. But for me personally, I like lightweight things most of the time, so Trello was great. So when they bought that was right down my alley. I could finally not feel guilty about liking Trello more. But yeah, the Atlassian thing was just a complete fluke. I mean, I started SourceTree because I was working on Ogre and we were switching from Subversion to distributed version control, and I'd had to look at Mercurial and Git. And at the time, Mercurial and Git were both sort of neck and neck when it came to adoption. It wasn't, a grand slam for Git at all at that point. In fact, when we did a community poll about which one we should use, it was pretty much split down the middle as to who preferred which one. And in the end, actually, initially, Ogre ran on Mercurial rather than Git, because Mercurial was a little bit more friendly to Windows at the time, and most of the game developers were on Windows, so it just kind of worked a little bit better. So yeah, after all this experience of trying to make these things work, and I was also maintaining the Mac version of Ogre at the time, just because no one else was doing it, so I bought a Mac and then figured out how to make it work. And I was just annoyed by the tools that were there, and I wasn't happy with the stuff that was going on. So I thought, well, I'm doing a lot of contract work, because the way I was making my living was doing contract work for people who used Ogre in games, but also a lot of the time not in games. That was fine, but the financial crisis had just happened. There were a lot of workers sort of falling off. I was getting a few gaps in my schedule, and I thought, well, it would be a good idea to try and use this time to do something else, and maybe I'll do a little side gig. Now that I've spent all this time learning how to use Git and Mercurial, and I'm not very happy with the tools that were available, particularly for Mac, I thought I'd just make one. And it was supposed to just be a side thing. I never imagined that it would make more than like a quarter of the money that I needed to run the business, and it would just be a little side thing ticking over, filling in the gaps. And then it just kind of blew up accidentally. And then Atlassian came along, and I didn't really necessarily want to sell it, but at the time, it occurred to me that of all the people who might want to buy it, Atlassian were quite a nice company in terms of the people there. It was quite small at the time. It was only about 400 people at the time.
This one were based in Sydney?
Yeah. So I went over to Sydney.
They still are, I think.
Yeah, the head office is still in Sydney, yeah, but they're obviously There's a lot of people around the world now.
Yeah, there's a couple of people in there.
Yeah, so when I joined, it was literally 400 people in Sydney. I think there was only about 80 people in San Francisco at the time, something like that, maybe even less. I can't remember. But the CEO the two CEOs had very compatible sort of ideologies to me. Very down to earth. They still wrote code. They still knew exactly why they wanted this product. It wasn't just a business thing. It was because they actually used it, which was nice. So yeah, I just kind of ended up following that for a while, even though I still wanted to get into game development, and I'd been trying for a decade, but ended up accidentally just making an engine instead and doing that most of the time. And then I accidentally went into source control.
From making it a 3D engine to source
control.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
But weirdly enough, you've brought it back a little bit, but what at the time was by creating also Git LFS.
Yeah.
Or a version, right? Because one of the problems that I've had has been like, well, okay, so now you're making games, right? All of the assets are big binary damn files, and like Git does not handle that well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I didn't make GitLFS, but I certainly joined the project. I made something else, which was very much like GitLFS, but actually at the same time as GitLFS was being made. That's the bizarre thing. I mean, it was getting to the point where we built up the team for Source Tree, and I was like, I kind of want a new challenge. I want to do something else. So we battled around a few ideas, and I'd obviously realised this problem with Git and large files, and the fact that game developers were having problems with it. And obviously, that's close to my heart. I thought, well, maybe I'll try and solve that. So I spent a few months building a prototype, which I called Git large objects. Yeah, I started working on that, and it turned out quite well. And I chose to use a language called Go to make it, because I like learning new things, and it seemed like a good way to make a command line tool in a sort of modern way. So I started working on that, and the funny thing was, we went to a Git convention, so the main Git convention, in sort of May 2015, I think it was, and we were going to present our Git large objects to this Git conference, and our talk slot was literally the one after GitHub were doing a slot, and both of us had come up with this quite vague title around sort of managing. I'm not even sure we mentioned managing large files. I think we just said something woolly around managing interesting objects or something like that. I can't remember. But both of us had fairly vague talk titles, and we were going to reveal it. And it turns out that what GitHub were going to talk about was GitLFS. And obviously we were going to talk about Git large objects literally half an hour later on the same stage. And we only found this out in the bar the night before, when people from Atlassian were talking to people from GitHub. I actually wasn't there because I had a family thing which I couldn't cancel. So actually, it was one of our developer relations people, and we talked about the presentation and worked on it together and stuff. So he was there, and he found out in the bar that this was going to happen. And of course, that was in San Francisco time, so there were messages in the Slack, at 2 a.m. saying, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" They're going to announce the same thing that we're going to announce, and we pretty much agreed within that small time window that the best thing to do was to merge the two projects, and for me to work, basically all the stuff that I worked on, and GitLFS did certain things better, so they already had integration with GitHub, which I hadn't started on the server side yet. I'd done more the sort of infrastructure on the client end. So I took all the stuff that I'd done on the client end and some of the infrastructure they didn't have yet and put that into GitLFS. And we just basically merged the projects and announced that we were going to do that sort of on the fly in that meeting, in that presentation. So that was interesting.
Wow. That's
crazy ride.
That's amazing.
And the bizarre thing was we both chose the same thing. We both chose to work on the Go language. We both designed it very similar to some other concepts that have come out before, but just a bit better architecture and a bit more practical to use in the scenarios that we envisaged. And yeah, there were so many commonalities between the two ways that we've done it. And neither of us had talked about it publicly at all. So neither of us knew the other one was working on it. So it was just a huge coincidence that happened. But I suppose a good one in the end, because we ended up just teaming up and making it better for everyone who used it in the end.
There's quite a few source control systems that seem to have sort of fallen by the wayside, really. I don't know if anyone ever used Alien Brain. I don't hear anything about Alien Brain now.
Right.
But everyone was all about Alien Brain back in the 2000s, and it was just like what everyone was going to use. And then suddenly it just sort of disappeared somewhere, and everyone just started using.
They're still
Perforce.
going. I'm actually following some of the Alien Brain people.
Wow.
Yeah, but Perforce, has come in. I absolutely hate it. I'll go
I really like it. I don't know why. I think I just used it so long that I kind of understand how it works. It's almost like a religion, I think. I've read all the scripture, so I know the rituals to get what I need to achieve.
Well, the incantations to check something in. Yeah, I mean, my problem is just that the documentation is terrible. It's like when you ask what this concept is, they refer to the concept itself as in part of the documentation. You know, it's like it's saying like, what is clone?
Oh yeah.
You know, I know what clone is in Git, right?
Clobber is great.
But if you go like, what is clone? Oh yeah, clobber. Exactly. What is clobber? Oh, a clobber's a file.
Well, yeah.
But what is clobber? What implications does that have?
Yes. Yeah.
Will that murder someone? Will someone die because I do this? You know, like you can't refer. You know, it's like this is the reason I hate PHP
Terminology.
Web developer here, right? Well, no, your PHP is the PHP hypertext processor. That's what PHP stands for. It's like, no, mate, you don't do recursion in your own damn.
Well, GNU started it, didn't it?
Jeez.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when you see all these different, I've used a lot of version control systems, and all of them they're always designed to fit a particular problem, right? No one just made it awkward for the sake of it. They genuinely thought this was the best way to do something, and it always comes out of whatever the thinking was behind it. And you know, you can pretty much hate any of them if you're using them in the context that they weren't originally designed for. And I've probably hated most of them at some point.
Oh well, at least you hate them, you know, equally.
Yeah.
I think for me it's like you just grow, you get used to them. Like you're right, the solution differs per project, and like I've tried Perforce, I've tried a lot of the like SVN solutions and stuff as well, and just going down that route, you get comfortable with it if you work on a project long enough to feel safe to commit, do this, do that. The documentation side of things has always been a massive taboo. I feel it's more you just learn from tribal knowledge on the project of what to do and what not to do, and you form your own work process.
We had a wonderful, an incredible meeting at one of my previous companies where the lead programmer, who was a very earnest, very precise, and very logical person, they decided to start using Perforce streams, and so we were all kind of corralled into a meeting where Perforce streams was described to us over the course of several hours. And at the end of the meeting, he just turned around and looked at us and said, "Do you understand?" Everyone just shook their heads. I was like, "No, I don't know at all."
Just tell me the incantation. Version control is always a hard topic because, as Steve says, it's like depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. Like we're trying to do a whole bunch of Git LFS stuff at the moment, and trying to explain it. It just saves it to Dropbox. Just don't worry about it, all right? It's just, that's what it does. It isn't, but that's the best way that I can...
I mean, funnily enough, I wrote a plugin which actually can save it to Dropbox if you want to. It's for my own use. I've been using GitLFS in all the projects I've worked on in the last few years, and I didn't want to have I like simplicity in almost all things. I hate things that are too complicated. So what I wanted was my simple Git setup where I just have literally an SSH connection to a server, and the Git repository is just in there. It's just a file system. I don't have to care about running any services. I don't have to care about any HTTP endpoints or anything like that. It's all just very, very basic. And unfortunately, GitLFS in its original design requires a lot of HTTP service endpoints to work.
Right.
Now, you can get around that because we wrote basically a custom sort of transport plugin system where you can provide your own little executables, which will do the transfer instead of using a HTTP kind of endpoint. So I did that and just basically made it delegate to any file system you like. So, it'll basically just serialize all of your large files to anywhere. So it could be your Dropbox drive, it could be a shared drive on your server, it could be anything at all. And I use that for my own personal setup, just because it's nice and simple. It's got obviously some downsides to it, and particularly in terms of nobody being able to noodle around inside that folder afterwards. Obviously anyone could, because it's a shared folder, anyone could start messing around on it, so it's not necessarily the most secure of systems, but for my use it's nice and simple, and the moving parts are kept to a minimum, so I quite like that setup.
When I was doing the indie developer FANG, I definitely missed the ability to just raise a support ticket to fix something on Perforce. The way I used to back up my whole Perforce depot to Amazon was by running these SSH commands that I'd written down in a notepad document. And at one point, I did them in slightly the wrong order, and ended up deleting my Perforce depot, but very, very slowly. And I was sitting there wondering why this command was taking such a long time to complete. And then I realized it was going through my entire depot, just deleting things gradually. and quit it and
Oh, yes.
managed. Oh, it was so horrendous. It was like, yeah, I only meant to go in there for 5 minutes, and that was the next 2 days of my life, was just fixing the horrible problem I created. So yeah, don't give SSH
Oh my
to
God.
designers.
I find it kind of interesting that you've kind of started out doing Ogre 3D, going version control, get LFS for games, and then like what, a couple of years ago, nearly 2 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, you started All Doorways Limited,
Yeah.
a game design company.
Yeah, basically, and it's a small indie company. I mean, basically, the reason was I am not getting any younger, and I've been trying to do this for some time. You know, it was we talked about Ogre, but Ogre started in 2000. Now, if you imagine, I've been trying to get into games since about 1985, and failed quite repeatedly, and only managed to do it sort of in small fits and starts because of various issues and getting distracted in various other directions, you know, as I have done. So I looked, you know, it was 2017, and I thought, well, if I don't do it now, when exactly am I going to do it? So I mean, I've talked about it with my wife Mary for a long time. We've always been talking about game design ideas, you know, especially when we're on holiday. It's a thing that we used to do on holiday a lot. Whenever we're sort of walking somewhere, we do a lot of walking. So if we go out, you know, walking in the Lake District or something, we'd be halfway along, you know, a couple of miles along a track or something, and then we'd start thinking, that game idea that we had, you know, 3 years ago, what about this twist on it? And it's like we talk about that, and every time we'd come home and we'd never get around to it because she'd be working, I'd be distracted with Ogre or Sorcery or whatever, and it would never happen. We'd have these notebooks full of ideas and full of half-finished concepts, and we never get around to it. And obviously I do little snippets here and there, but I've always found, I mean, particularly since about 10 years ago, I had a bit of a back injury because I was working too many hours, and I stopped being able to do as many side gigs as I used to do. I used to spend a lot of time doing, you know, hobby projects and things like that. And I stopped being able to do that. I had to do other things other than sitting at a computer into the late nights. So I had to start prioritizing. And in a way, that sort of helped me. That actually sort of led to Sorcery because I started to do fewer things and started to perhaps give a bit more thought about what exactly I was going to spend my time on, rather than when I was younger, I would just think, I'll just try and do everything. Yeah, I don't have to prioritize. I can just spend more time. Obviously,
Because there's plenty of time.
Yeah.
That's all we have, right?
Exactly. So yeah, it got to the point where I was thinking, well, you know, if we're going to do it, it has to be now. And we had a little bit of runway from having done the Atlassian thing, and I figured, you know, I might as well spend some of this money that we've saved over the years, just effectively burning our own runway to see how far we can get. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But you know, we'll at least try our best. And maybe try and get at least a couple of games shipped before we hit the half century. So we shipped one, which is a start, and hopefully we will do some more.
Wow, that's amazing. It's kind of weird. I was looking at it, September 2017, around the same time I decided to do exactly the same thing for pretty much the same reasons. But I'm doing 2 gigs. I'm doing the burning the candle at both ends and seeing how much, you know, once it gets to the middle, half century, I just probably just burst into flames. And,
You'll ascend to a new level of consciousness.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or just burn out and just be like quivering wreck in the corner.
No, it's ascension. We have to believe it's ascension, not burnout.
It's sublime into a
Yeah, it's going to be the singularity of game development. But it's kind of it's a similar feeling that I think a lot of the people that we've talked on this podcast kind of come from the university into game development because that's what they wanted to do. I never thought that was even possible, you know, until a few years ago with, ironically enough, closing the gap with a game from the Chinese room, which is, so it was Dear Esther. And I was looking at, I'm not saying that it was simple or easy or anything like that, but I was looking at going, hey, you can do experiences, right? That's cool. And I was thinking, I can do an experience. I mean, I think I can. And that led me to get into this stuff.
I think the draw for, especially like a lot of people like yourselves deciding to make the switch is realizing like games are so much more than just scoring system, point attack and things like that. Like you said, you started to see these experience-like games. It's like we spoke on a previous episode about Gone Home, and that was another big one that like sparked the idea for a lot of other smaller companies, like indie companies, to start as well and try and build their experiences, but not having to necessarily deliver this AAA blockbuster, because that's not the only way to make a game. Like you can make these more even better personal experiences that maybe a small fraction of people can relate to, but because it's not costing you billions to make, it's now becoming slightly more accessible for people to take a shot at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's why a lot of people also join the gaming industry now, is due to the smaller experiences they see, and they're like, okay, maybe I can help contribute to that. You're not gonna see a AAA game like Assassin's Creed and be like, yes, I can make that myself. You're seeing the more
Just
related,
by
yeah,
yourself,
just by myself.
Just one
I
person.
can do it. It will only take 50 years. So you see those smaller games and you relate to something.
They're also usually built in like a different way as well. Like you'll notice that if you work with an indie company or by yourself and there's only a couple of you versus working for a structured studio like a big AAA studio, like the work pipelines and stuff are quite different. And obviously, but when I compare past projects I worked on in the indie field to the projects I'm doing now with Hanger, the design aspect and everything like that remains the same. The skills I've got, the processes I go through, they're largely the same. But the actual protocol of how development works and production works at a bigger company is far more distributed.
Yeah, it's funny. I've got a slightly different reason, or different trigger really, because when I started wanting to get into games, things were already extremely simple. Obviously I started in the early 80s. Everything didn't matter. Even the highest level games that were being produced were very, very simple, and there was actually a window. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say about how there's like a threshold recently of people realizing that games can be smaller. It's funny because to me that was the idea that games had to be massive was only a weird little anomaly in the middle. It was like from about 2007, 2008 or so onwards, things started to go crazy because, I mean, I obviously thought that I could build an engine that people could use to make games, and I could do it on my own to begin with, at least. And that's because when I started it in 2000, things were relatively simple. We were talking about, sort of the best thing you could get AAA wise was about sort of Jedi Knight 1 sort of quality graphics, just probably PS2 sort of level stuff, which still seemed achievable to us even then. And it was only as time went on that obviously art budgets in particular got bigger and bigger and bigger. And around 2006 and 2007, we thought, well, hang on, this is actually getting well out of our sort of purview now as fairly amateur people. And at that point, what happened then is people like PopCap came along, and those were kind of the inspiration for a lot of the stuff that we like, because we loved the old sort of Plants vs Zombies and Hegel and those sort of games back in the day, and those were the sort of experiences that we latched onto initially, in terms of these are sort of arcadey but modern kind of experiences, and those were the sort of things we were initially going for, which is why Washed Up was one of the reasons for Washed Up being a two-dimensional game was just because of the art limitations. It was easier for Mary to come from her previous background of doing mostly 2D arts, and she'd never done game art before, so there was a lot of learning in terms of formats and how you figure out the pixel ratio for various art assets and things like that. It was easier for her to come across to 2D and then work up from there. So yeah, that was sort of our inspiration mostly. And I love Dear Esther and a lot of these sort of what people would sort of pejoratively call walking simulators. I mean, I don't mind because I like walking. That's one of
That's literally up your alley.
yeah,
right?
exactly right. I enjoy doing that in real life. Why wouldn't I like it in places that I couldn't go normally? But yeah, those are great as well. But it's funny how scale kind of blew up for a while, and obviously still is blown up in terms of the big AAA stuff. But there was sort of a window where everyone thought the only thing you could possibly do was that big thing. And I think either side of it, there was the idea that you could do small things. It was just people forgot for a while.
It's almost like there's been a sort of Cambrian explosion of evolution in games, in that the very, very high budget games took over from the kind of ancestors and shot off into these very successful sort of megafauna things, whereas there's still the kind of the happy little mice and things still running around, and it's existing quite well along with everything else. And yeah, I think that's absolutely, as you say, it's that kind of game has never really gone away, and certainly as well with the rise of mobile gaming, I would say that more people play that type of game than anything else.
Yeah, and we saw quite a lot of it in the late 2000s. A lot of people that ended up using Ogre were kind of German companies who were making small strategy games or adventure games and that sort of thing. And this was still poodling along in the background there quite happily while the AAA stuff was going mad. I mean, I blame the normal map for the explosion. As soon as someone invented the idea of a normal map, suddenly our budgets went completely mad, and suddenly we couldn't build them anymore. But yeah, it was still happening. It was just obviously didn't look as fancy and didn't push the latest consoles to their greatest possible arc. But yeah, it was still there, and obviously I don't think it's ever really gone away.
It's kind of interesting to hear you say that, especially since recently you've been also experimenting in one of the AAA engines, which is Unreal Engine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's an interesting exploration, because you went back to study C++ at some point, didn't you? You didn't start out with a computer science degree, but you went back to do the.
Well, I mean, I taught myself C, pre C++, back in about 1990, I think it was. That's when I started, and then I moved on to C++, sort of mid 90s, something like that, and then obviously did C++ all the way through Ogre, because that was C++, until about 2010. So it was only at that point that I started. I mean, I was using a lot of languages anyway, because I wasn't getting paid to do game development or Ogre to begin with. So I was doing business development, originally COBOL, and I was doing some Java, some Visual Basic. All
you can earn so much money now with COBOL if you live in New Jersey. Actually, I lied. I found out that they're looking for loads of COBOL programmers, but they don't want to pay them the actual rate.
Yeah, that's typically
and
the way.
You're like, wait a minute. So there's very few of them, but you don't want to pay them.
Yeah, so I spent a long time, in C++, and because that was the way you had to write things in that sort of time period. And obviously, at that point, we knew about Unreal 3, but obviously you had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to use it at that point. So that's partly why we'd make our own. And yeah, but when I obviously took a time out from doing game stuff for about 6 or 7 years. And when I came back, the best way to get back into it seemed to be Unity for us, because we're very small. I could write in C++, but I don't necessarily think that you should necessarily use the most obvious language. If you're looking that you already know, if you're trying to start a new project, you should use whatever language and tool fits that project, not necessarily what it is that you naturally fall towards. And I did that with Source Tree, actually. I learned Objective-C just so that I could write Source Tree. It's sort of similar to C anyway, but it's got a lot of square brackets kicking around that are a bit weird. So I've always believed in learning the tools that are most relevant to you at the time. So Unity was the best one for me to go for at that time, just because it was quite easy to learn, quite suited to a small scale situation, very suited to two-dimensional games, which is where we wanted to start. And then recently, things have changed over the last 4 years in various ways. I'm actually writing a blog post about this at the moment. And one of those things is we've moved more into three-dimensional stuff. So Mari has learned how to use Maya and is now learning Blender. Our recent game was 3D. We've done a couple of prototypes that were 3D as well that haven't shipped. But, as a team, I obviously did a lot of 3D before, but not necessarily in game design terms, more in the sort of technical engine side. So I'm learning a whole bunch of new things in terms of, just design aspects, gameplay space stuff, artificial intelligence, anything really that I haven't really covered just from a visual rendering point of view. And we now sort of feel that we can make some good 3D work with the amount of resources we've got and the knowledge we've got. And I feel happier that I know enough about game development that Unreal doesn't feel quite so daunting. I would say, even though I've got a lot of background in trying to do game development, Unreal, going from 0 to Unreal is quite a big step, particularly if you're doing it on your own, if you're the only coder. So I thought, might as well, especially because we're doing 2D stuff to begin with, might as well ease yourself in slowly. And I wasn't necessarily planning on switching to Unreal later, but a confluence of things, both our own position, the sort of things we're working on, and some of the features I want to start using. So I want to start using a bit of networking, and Unreal's got a bit more maturity in that area. And just there's a few things around Unity right now which have made it a little bit less stable of a platform. So I've been looking at Unreal thinking maybe I should give it another go, because I decided 4 years ago that I wouldn't use it for various reasons, including that C++ is not, even though I've got 20 plus years experience on it, is not necessarily the most productive when you're just a single programmer and trying to just be as efficient as possible.
I found a lot of Unreal, which was because I did Unity for quite a while, so doing C# is not a problem for a web developer. It's like literally you fall into it. But I went to Unreal because I didn't want to do coding as my side project. I mean, even though you are, because you're solving those problems, but I wanted to solve them in a different way, make them more fun. And the blueprinting engine so far can take you maybe 80-90% of the way with a lot of stuff.
I've been very impressed by blueprints. Now, this is part of my blog post, but I I have a history with visual programming.
Oh, really?
Back in 2000, now we're going back a bit now, but back in 2000, I was working on a big enterprise system, which was Java, but we used a thing called IBM's Visual Age for Java. And it pushed very, very heavily on the visual programming paradigm. And all of the user interface you built, everything that really supported those user interfaces was all visual coding. And it's, if you look at it on the surface, it looks ugly now, but on the surface, it's very similar to what Blueprints does. However, at the time, I was working in a team of about 12 people, and this tool was quite new. It had lots of problems. It didn't have particularly great ways of debugging things. The code generators were a bit wonky sometimes. It was a horrible experience. It was one of these things where we found it was very easy to build things, but it was very, very difficult to realize what the hell you had built afterwards, or try to understand it. And I realize now that a lot of that was the tooling, was just not mature enough, and the way that we could express things was not mature enough. The trouble is that has coloured my experience of visual coding for a very long time, and I would stay away from visual coding as if it was the plague. I avoided it for material systems. I avoided it for blueprints. So when I looked at Unreal last time, one of the reasons I chose not to use it was that I thought I would just have to use C++ for everything, because using visual coding would just not sit with me the way that I would want. Now, my opinion's changed over the last sort of 4 years. It's been a number of things. One, we're working in a very small team, so it's less difficult to keep track of what's going on. One of the problems with the visual coding in a big team was just loads of stuff was changing all the time, and if you couldn't unpick it very easily, and it took you twice as long to figure out what on earth this thing did, that was a major problem. You've got 11 other people who are doing things, and you've got to try and understand all of that going on, and you can't diff it. You can't look at the logs, the Git logs as you would do now and do code review, because there's no way to diff it particularly easily, and it was just a horrible nightmare. But when I'm working in such a small environment, that doesn't really come into it. It's less of an issue. The tooling is vastly better. It's night and day compared to what we were used to before. And I've also sort of mellowed a bit in my old age, I think. It's one of those things where you have very strong opinions when you're younger about what's good and what's bad about technology. And I think I've experienced enough of it now to realise that probably everything that I write is probably bad, if you look at it from a certain point of view. So I shouldn't probably be as judgmental about other things. So,
well, I think any code that you write in 6 months, you look back on it and go, like, what the hell?
Yeah, precisely.
It's one of those things that, like, you do it enough times, you realise that whatever thing you're writing now is crap. You might think it's genius, but in 6 months' time, you look back on it and go like, I've learned. It's you that's changing, not your code.
And this is my obsession with simplicity, is that the only way I can really insulate myself against myself is by writing things as simply as possible. The dumb solution is always better than the clever one, unless it absolutely has to be. I also would like, at the moment we're really quite split between me doing programming and Mary doing art. However, I dip into the art side sometimes, because sometimes I just want to try things out. I don't want to waste her time, or sort of have to wait for her to do something. If I can just bash something out really quickly that's rubbish, but at least I can test the idea. She would show me sometimes, rigs that she's made in Maya, which is this load of visual mathematical nodes that she's built. And I'm saying, you realize that you just built something that's really just programming, right? It doesn't feel like that to her, because it's all visual. So when I saw that, I thought, well, really, I'm making things worse by being so opinionated about things have to be code rather than visual. And, it's not just about what I like. Perhaps we can come to a sort of middle ground that works for everybody. And having tried to do that, I think Blueprints is a really good solution for that. So I'm definitely still going to have to write some C++. There's no doubt about that. However, it's going to be hopefully in all the corners where there just needs to be something particularly tight or particularly complicated that needs to be C++. And almost everything else, I'm hoping, is going to be Blueprints. So we shall see.
I've seen a massive increase in nodes programming or blueprint style programming or whatever you want to call it, like substances. Bolt, which I was going like, wait a minute, that's blueprints. And then I thought, well, okay, yeah. So there's also like Substance Designer. There is, as you say, Maya's already got it. Houdini. You can do a lot of visual stuff, but you're generally just working around your nodes. And Blender, which is now has got a massive amount of node programming in it. Even though I'm always doing this at the same
absolutely.
Node,
back in the day using Unreal, it was always the big thing. Anyone who'd used Unreal before, they would say to you, you've got to do things in the Unreal way. You have to do them in the way that the engine designed them to do. If you don't, you try and do it a different way, you're going to be working uphill the whole time. and that has never really stopped being true. And I'd say one of the biggest new skills in using Unreal nowadays is understanding where that dividing line of C++ and Blueprint lies, and accurately placing that line and going, I understand at what point the C++ needs to come out into the sort of content side and be exposed to all the depredations and improvements that your team might make to it.
The impression I get is that it will depend very much on the size of your team. I think I feel a lot more comfortable because we are so small that we can do more things in Blueprints. I think if there was a lot of code to be written or a lot of functionality to be added, I'd be much more leaning towards C++, just because it's just easier to merge changes and easier to review everybody's work. But the way we are right now, I think it works quite well to try and minimize the amount of C++ that I have to write, despite the fact that I'm notionally a coder first and foremost.
It's a joy sometimes to be able to just throw a few nodes together and it does it. I don't worry about compiling or about anything, and it just does it. But there's times that you go like, why is this node not complete? I'm not looking at you listing of number of levels. Like if you want to load a level, why isn't there just like a drop down? Anyway, that's not a bugbear that I have a lot.
I have a question for you, Steve. So you have a very extensive background in open source creation of software. I wonder what you think about whether there is some dividing line between the sort of open source collaboration of creating software and open source collaboration of creative efforts, and what is the nature of that dividing line? Is it purely a kind of organizational production thing, or is it the fact that creative stuff, say the games that you make, are they somehow personal to you in a way that it's not practical, or it's not in their nature to be shared in that way and opened up to the open source kind of thing?
It's funny, someone, I can't remember who it was, someone posted on Twitter just recently, just last week I think it was, and was kind of mooting the idea of having a collaborative sort of open source approach to a game development project, and would people be open to this sort of thing? And there were a lot of good comments on that from both people who have been in open source and in game development. My personal view of it is that open source works because everybody who's contributing to it is somehow getting something out of it as well, and they're getting something out of it quite directly. They're almost certainly using it. They wouldn't have any other reason to be participating if they weren't. So there's a very easy line between, here's something that I put in, and I might be putting in way more work than I ever use, but I am still getting something out of it. And I know it sort of sounds a bit selfish, but I think the rational self-interest is necessary as a motivator. And I think the trouble with creative projects is that it's a very hit and miss thing. Whether the project finishes at all is one thing, whether it's successful when it does finish, and then it's a case of within that, who is the creative director of that? Who is making the decisions? And there will be some. You can sort of do the whole woolly, let's have a collaborative project idea up to a certain point, but eventually someone's going to have to decide something. There's going to be some sort of conflicting idea. Someone's going to say, no, we can't have all 5 of these ideas. There has to be 2 of them. The other 3 have to die.
I mean, I wonder if the analogy between like a bridge and a painting is fair. I think it may be a bit reductive, but you could say
I think that's a good one.
That you can't sort of disagree about the fact that steel has a certain engineering capability, but whether you could argue endlessly about what colour a shirt in a painting.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. What I would say is, at least with the bridge, there is actually a defined set of mathematical bases for it. They have that no one can argue with.
And everyone who helps build the bridge gets to use it, don't they? Like in your, as you said before,
yeah, exactly.
Everyone who helps build the bridge gets to use it, whereas only one person can have the painting in their front room.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we share it on weekends.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Steve.
Yeah. I mean, notionally, if it's like a library or something like that, then there is perhaps a more engineering focus on it, so that does make things easier for sure. However, there is still a kind of direction aspect of that as well. And normally what happens with that sort of setup is that someone will have started it, because it's normally someone has had a go at it and they've put it online and then it's grown from there. So there tends to be a kind of most of the time at least, a natural ceding of control of opinion to one person or a couple of people, the sort of benevolent dictator kind of thing. So someone is at least there. Hopefully they're not horrible, hopefully they're nice people, but notionally they're there to at least break deadlocks and make sure that something happens if there's a lot of conflicting ideas and potential ways that you could go. And not everyone may agree, but at least when it's a utilitarian kind of thing, even if they don't necessarily agree with all of the things, all of the direction that's been decided on, someone is still going to benefit from it. Even if you don't like the way that they've decided to take this particular open source project, probably it's still going to work for you. It's not going to completely rule it out as a thing that's going to be acceptable to you. Whereas with the creative project, it's very much more emotional. So, if you lose control of that and it was something that you really, really cared about, that's devastating. It's going to be, this is a problem no matter whether it's a commercial project or an open source project. That happens in commercial projects, obviously. But at least at that point, you're getting paid for it. So that's sort of a salve for your wounds, to a degree at least. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the concept of collaborative creative projects. Like they can work sometimes, but it's very much hit and miss thing. I've been involved in a number of little commercial projects, mostly actually before open source. It was back in the 90s when I get together with a few friends and we try and make something together, and they almost never worked. We'd get to a certain point and it would fall apart for whatever reason, disagreements of things or different directions. Someone would go off in a completely different direction and not tell anybody. It's just the way it would go. And you can't tell them off because they're doing it in their own time. So it's, they can do whatever they want.
You said you wanted to release some games before the half century mark. What have you released so far? What are you about to release?
So we've released a game called Washed Up, which is our first commercial release. It's basically, if you imagine Tetris, but you were using pentominoes instead of tetranominoes. And they were coming in from...
What?
They're pentominoes. It means they're made out of 5 squares. So each block is a sort of an arrangement of 5 smaller squares.
Okay.
So there's a few more arrangements obviously you can get out of that compared to the Tetris blocks. We actually were quite careful never to mention the word Tetris on our Steam page, of course, just in case.
Of course,
just in case. But that's it's a similar idea, and that you're trying to put blocks together, and they're coming in from the left and right hand sides rather than just from the top, and they sort of settle on the beach, and it's up to you how you pick them up and what order you put them in the center, and you're trying to make squares rather than lines, and it's about trying to tidy up the beaches before they get horribly polluted by all this stuff that humans have dumped in the ocean. And you're basically you're sort of notionally controlling these little crabs which come out of the ocean and pick up the blocks and move them around to where they need to go. Yeah, so that was our first game. That was kind of a design from Mary mostly, because we started it in one of the global game jams. I forget which year it was, 2016 I think, maybe 2017. And we kind of left it alone for a while. It was a very rudimentary version at that point, and then we just came back to it 2017 and decided to pick it up and make it into a full game. And we're quite pleased with it. It's our first game, our first baby that we've put out into the world. It hasn't done big numbers at all, but the people who have intersected with it and have played it have all given us very nice feedback. We've had a lot of people saying we've really enjoyed playing it, and that is kind of what makes our day at the moment. We never really expected to be commercially successful, our first game or first 3 games maybe, we'll have to see. But it was just nice to have at least some people appreciating it and having fun with it. And
that's on Steam, so we're going to put the link in the show notes so that you can be amazingly rich because so many people listen to the podcast.
Thank you. It's very good of you. Yeah, so we released that late 2018, and then since then we've done a couple of prototypes which didn't really pan out, unfortunately. But then we did one prototype which we really enjoyed making. It was basically a Peggle kind of thing, a Peggle game which was rendered in 3D and had lots of HDR effects and basically a synthwave aesthetic, because that's kind of my jam at the moment. Really enjoyed doing that, and then we discovered there's a patent which covers pretty much anything even remotely related to Peggle, even some of the really wild things that we'd intended to do. So we thought, okay, we're doing something that's vastly different to Peggle. We'll build basically Peggle first so that we understand why Peggle is good, and then we'll add all the other stuff we think is going to be good on top of that. And as it turned out, we discovered it was actually Christmas that we discovered it. It was a great discovery at Christmas, that I happened to look and find that there's a patent that covers that. So we thought about it, and we thought, well, to take it where we want to take it, it's going to take another year plus, to really polish it where we want to go. We didn't want to throw it away though, so I spent a couple of months just polishing it a little bit more, getting it to the point where it was actually a game, even if it was just a prototype. And because it's got its own level editors, you can make your own levels and everything. So it was nice to be able to give it to people So they could just experiment with it, make their own levels and things. And then we released it to everybody who's on our mailing list sort of 6 weeks ago, roughly, just for free, just so that someone gets to play it. And we still play it. It's still good fun. I'm actually going to do an update to it, probably in the next couple of weeks, just to add some more levels that we've been working on. But we're really proud of it. It's just a shame that we can never actually release it, or at least until I think the patent expires in 2028. So maybe we'll pick it up.
Just a few more years.
Yeah, no one can patent navel gazing walking simulators, so we're fine.
Well, I mean, this is the thing about walking simulators. I think Steve should try out. It's like Death Stranding. That's an actual walking simulator rather than a first-person explorer, I guess, because you literally are falling over and having to, balance and stuff.
Yeah.
So
You're not meant to be falling over.
You're playing it wrong.
Don't tell
look,
don't
I'm
tell
going to
us
play
about
the
it.
game however I want to play the game. Man.
It's his game. You can play it how he wants.
Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. If people want to seek you out, where should they go?
So I guess Twitter is the most active place I am. So it's just at Steve Streeting.
I like people with just their names as Twitter handles. You see, I completely approve.
Yeah, it's very simple. It's just not very fashionable. But there we go.
Yeah.
I know I've been particularly fashionable, so that's fine. It's on brand.
And they can go to Steam and look at Washed Up.
They can indeed, yeah. And keep an eye on our website. We will be publishing more games in the future, but it'll be a little while.
That's stevestreeting.com?
Our company website is olddoorways.com.
Oh, right. Old Always, yeah.
But yeah, my personal one is stevestreeting.com, which is perhaps a bit more active in terms of blogging.
And we should be looking for your blog. Hopefully, by the time this episode is out, the blog post about your experiences with Unreal Engine will be out.
Yeah, I've actually had to split it. I've written 5,500 words, and it was getting too long, so I've split it into part 1, which is probably the most controversial bits, and then part 2 we'll do all the nice bits.
So you've done the Huffington Post kind of thing to put the shock, 10 things that will shock you about Unreal
I mean,
Engine.
I think it's actually quite nice in terms of, I don't think it's trying to be horrible to anybody, but I know that there's going to be people who just don't agree with my opinions of C++, even though I've certainly earned my chops in the C++ department, but I'm sure people will still hate me for saying that I'm not really that keen on it anymore, but we'll see.
But Steve, also remember that it might be an age thing. It's like you get old, you get experienced at it, and then the young people have strong opinions.
I think if you used if you used programming language for a certain amount of time, you should get like a sword that gets longer and longer and sharper the more you know. And you can actually just go and fight them, and then that.
Yeah. So the people with the pen knives coming at you, you're like, ah! And on that note, I want to thank you, Steve. I want to thank you, Valentina. Where can they find you on the internets?
So yeah, my Twitter handle is Valentina CHRYS. That's probably the best location to find me.
Rob?
Yeah, you can find me at RM McLaughlin. Good luck spelling McLaughlin.
And Jonathan?
Yeah, you can always reach out to me on Twitter at omni/92.
And if you can't, you can always tweet us at Level Design FM or email us at show@leveldesign.fm. Thank you very much, and thank you to our guests and our hosts. Goodbye.
See ya.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.
The Level Design Podcast has been a Command Studio production. Our editor is Matthew Lever, and this episode has been produced by Bridal Road.